Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. It is, for me at least, a kind of a dreary, drizzly morning, but those are actually mornings that I absolutely love because they always make me feel a little bit cozy. I know this is very cliche to say, but makes me want to curl up with like a blanket and just get super comfortable on the couch, which of course I'm not doing right now, but I do have my coffee here, which is always a good start for a cozy, comfy morning. Hopefully you're in a similar space and you've got something happening already to brighten your week. If you are watching this video for the first time, or any of these videos for the first time, my name is Taryn Hewitt. I am a work-life balance coach, and I work specifically with overachievers, right? So overachievers have an entirely different set of challenges when it comes to work-life balance. You are those people who have a million different things on your list, and even on outside of what you have on your list, you have more goals, more aspirations, more things that you want to accomplish in your life, and you may just struggle to find time to get everything done or time for yourself. And so that is all the work that I do, is helping overachievers create more time for themselves and all the things that they love to do. So as part of that, I do have a Facebook group, which is Work-Life Balance for Overachievers. And these videos are our weekly series of Bright Spot videos, which is all about kind of shifting the thought process around Monday. So we're bringing the gloom away from Monday and filling it with brightness by providing tips and tricks and things that you can apply to your life right away to make continuous progress towards that incredible work-life balance, right? So today's topic is a really interesting one, and I feel like it's one that we don't talk about enough, which is why we're talking about it now. So we are going to be talking today about how accepting negative emotions can have really surprising benefits. And so I say that because most of us, when we experience negative emotions, have some level of fight or flight response that occurs with them. And they're negative emotions. Everybody has negative connotations with them, which is really understandable. So our inclination is to either fight back against whatever is creating the emotions, or the inclination is to run away from the emotions. But either way, what's essentially happening when you do that is you're not necessarily processing those emotions. They just kind of sit there on the surface and they fester, and they have really negative ripple effects across the rest of your life and the stress that you're feeling and all of that. And my mission when I first started coaching, and my mission when I started working with overachievers and working with work-life balance, has always been about creating positive ripple effects. That's my why. That's why I do the work that I do. And so when we talk about accepting negative emotions, it's actually going to create a positive ripple effect in your life if you're able to do that. And so it sounds counterintuitive, but it's really amazing when you start playing with it. And so we're going to dive into it right now. So the first thing that I really want to hit on before I dive too deep is the difference between acceptance and resignation. They are two very different things, but they can oftentimes feel or sound similar. And in fact, I will say, I'll just admit that for me, resignation is something that I struggled with for a very long time. So I am somebody who I've always considered myself to be a very positive person. I could always see the silver lining of a situation. And when I first entered into the world of coaching and I first really started diving into, understanding my own emotions and understanding the thoughts that lead to things and how those impact everything in my life, I realized that was one thing that was really big for me. I was tolerating a lot. I was resigning myself to difficult situations and not processing. So I am very familiar with this area of emotion work. So the difference, so let's just talk some definitions for a second. So acceptance, when we look at it from a psychology perspective, is the active embracing of a subjective experience, particularly distressing experiences. And one of the key pieces there is that it's not only the active embracing, but it's active embracing without defense. Okay. And then resignation, on the flip side, is giving up on changing things, settling for what happens, even if it hurts us. So there's kind of two things there, right? Like one of them feels very open. I mean, it feels accepting because it's acceptance, right? That's where my brain goes. But it's also, I would say, very welcoming to every aspect of it. And I think that's one thing that's really key when we start talking about acceptance. It's a very normal thing to assume that anything negative has to then be bad. But the reality is that negative emotions are oftentimes protecting us from something. And so at their core, negative emotions have this really positive intent. If they were a person, right, we would say they had all the best intentions. It just wasn't coming across right. Right? And so there is a love and a peace to kind of realizing that negative emotions can be good for you. They can have this really wonderful protective nature to them. And so what our job is to understand what that protective nature is and then make decisions and choices with that information. That's how you start to make real progress in your life. That's how you start to switch that negative ripple effect into a positive ripple effect. Resignation, on the other hand, is almost like if you heard from that definition, it's almost like accepting that it's going to happen and then therefore accepting that it's going to keep happening and you're just going to keep getting hurt. So there's no processing there. There's no resolution to it. It's just kind of like, I'm gonna keep, getting pinched or whatever the case is, and I'm just going to be okay with it. So there's no peace there. There's no love there. There's no progress of any kind. So let's talk about what happens when you suppress negative emotions. So doing that in any way is always going to have some kind of negative consequence. Sometimes that shows up as increased stress. Sometimes that comes up as negative impact on other relationships. In fact, it's really interesting. I just had this conversation with a client recently who was self-aware enough to realize that there was some negative emotion that was coming up, and the way her brain was reacting to that negative emotion was to actually deflect it to the other people around her. So to other people that were in her life, she was suddenly blaming them. She was angry at them. And there was, when we dove into it and we worked through an acceptance exercise, what we found is that the negative emotion was entirely about her and something that she was feeling. It had nothing at all to do with those people in her life, but part of her brain's light response to that negative emotion was to deflect it to others so that she didn't have to feel it. She didn't have to acknowledge it for herself. And those are things that I've had similar experiences, but that's very high level, right? I'm not going to go into like the specific details of this person's story, but you can probably hear that and recognize maybe instances where you might have done that yourself. And so it becomes really easy to see how it can have that negative impact on other relationships. The other thing that I would say is really negative about suppressing negative emotions is that it reinforces a state of helplessness and hopelessness. So what I mean by that is if you go back to that definition of resignation, he said it's settling for what happens even if it hurts us. If you're settling and you've just accepted that something negative is going to happen to you and you're going to allow it to keep hurting you, what you're telling your brain every time you allow that is that there's nothing you can do in that situation. There's no room for change. There's no hope that anything could be different. And I'm just a big believer in there always being hope. There's always a way to help ourselves into a situation that we would prefer. And so that's just something that you really want to be aware of. If you're just, tolerating negative emotions, you're also reinforcing all of these other things that can, again, have a negative ripple effect in other areas of your life. So then let's talk about the benefits of accepting negative emotions. So, to a degree, it's a lot of things that are counter to what we just said the negative impacts are. But one of them is improved mental health. So I'm going to pause there because just like other pieces that we've talked about, that might sound funny, right? It might sound funny to say that by accepting negative emotions, your mental health will improve. But it will, because think about what I just talked about the example of my client and how she had this negative emotion that was about herself and something that she was feeling. It had nothing to do with anybody else, but she deflected it into other areas and other relationships. Now, that stress that she was feeling associated with that negative emotion has now expanded, right? It's including other people. Those other people are then going to respond, and that's going to increase the amount of stress that she's having in those relationships. Right. Again, it's a ripple effect. So when you can accept negative emotions, what you're doing is you're really containing the stress that you're having, and then you're also transforming it. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as I continue the benefits. But what this also leads to is better decision-making skills. So again, when we have that fight or flight response, and we deflect or we avoid or whatever our natural inclination is to a negative emotion, what we're also doing or not doing in that case is we're not paying attention to the signal that our brain is telling us. So I mentioned before that negative emotions are often your brain trying to protect you from something. If you don't know what it's trying to protect you from, you can't make a decision whether you want that protection or not, right? So you will just react subconsciously, unconsciously, however you want to say it. You will react without necessarily thinking about it. And so then you're not really deploying what I would call strong decision-making skills. You're making decisions without all of the information, right? So accepting negative emotions is going to improve your decision-making skills. It's also going to improve your emotional intelligence, right? So the more aware you become of your negative emotions, the more aware you become of why those negative emotions surface, and the more accepting you become of those, the better you become at responding to all situations that involve emotions of any kind, but especially those negative emotions, right? So I will give you an example of this for myself. So recently I had some, fairly large arguments with my husband on something. And I spent a lot of time, because of the work I do, I did spend a lot of time preparing for what I knew was going to be an argument, and kind of practicing this acceptance that the situation might be difficult, that I needed to be okay with there being negative emotions in the situation because of what it meant, right? Like being okay with the negative emotions meant that I was standing my ground. It meant that I was standing for something that was really important to me. But what I realized after spending even more time having these arguments, doing a deeper analysis on what I was feeling in the moment, is I realized that I was going into these arguments already expecting something difficult. And so I prepared for the difficult rather than examining the negative emotions that we're already preparing for the negative experience, right? It's very meta. It sounds funny. You're probably listening to this and trying to follow backwards to what it was. But my point is that in this example that I have from my own personal life, I was prepared for the situation because I knew that it was going to be something that my husband was going to be resistant to. And that's what I was preparing for. What I didn't realize until I did a deeper acceptance exercise was that it was easier. Like I realized that I had some reservations about the situation as well. There were some things that I was hesitating on, that I was unsure of, but it was easier for me to deflect that blame to my husband and prepare for his resistance on it than it was to acknowledge my own resistance to it and what that meant for me and how I wanted to handle that, right? So our brains are just crazy, complex things. They like to get in our way, mostly because, again, they're trying to protect us. And so the sooner you can kind of embrace that idea of any negativity being a source of protection and love, the easier this will become, and the easier it is to start processing and accepting these negative emotions. So what are some things that you can do if this is really resonating with you and you want to start working on processing and accepting negative emotions right now? One of the first things that you can do is focus on mindfulness. So what we mean by that is really becoming more aware in the moment that you are experiencing something negative, so that you can then decide if you want to examine it further or dig into it. So one of the biggest things many of us struggle with is that when we do experience negative emotions, it just happens as a reaction. It's very instinctual and reflexive. Yes. So it is a reflex that happens without us even really being aware of it. And so awareness is always going to be that first step to examination and therefore learning and application. One of the best ways that you can do that, in my experience, is to then journal through it, right? So what that means is you might start with journaling as just a base point of recognizing and acknowledging negative emotions that actually occurred. And then you can take it a step further and actually start examining those negative emotions. So what triggered them? What made them come up? What are the actual emotions? Sometimes it like just naming them and getting really, really clear on what the emotion is going to bring an entirely different level of meaning to it than what you might have realized in the moment, right? But then there are other things that you can start to recognize. So when you have that emotion, what labels are you applying to it? Are you judging yourself for having that emotion? What are you making that emotion mean about you and your reaction to the situation, right? So there are so many different questions that you can ask. This is something we dive really deep into in coaching. So if this is something that you want to explore more and something that you think would be really helpful, drop a comment below, send me a message, however you want to get in touch with me. I'm here, I'm ready to help. And these are the types of things that I just think are so interesting because of how our brain works. And I love digging into them because I know that it has such an amazing impact on your life once you're able to start doing this. So that has been our discussion today on accepting negative emotions and the surprising benefits that comes with that. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Hopefully you got some really great tips, and hopefully you start to understand this really kind of contradicting but really interesting idea of how accepting negative emotions can have this really wonderful positive ripple effect on every area of your life. Have a wonderful, wonderful week, everyone, and we will see you next time. Bye.